Welcome to session 2 of chapter 3. In this session, we're going to be playing with the About page of Pandalisa Chocolates and working on some grid layouts, understanding how to do the layouts. Let's get started. First thing we're going to do is talk about how you would design a grid layout. As you see in the graphic that I have here on the slide, you can change things into, set it up as a series of rows and columns, but then you can have multiple rows and columns inside each of those items. You can have some consistent logical design. This is where I want my header. This is where I want my asides. This is where I want my articles. This is where I want my footer. Again, we've talked about the idea that you can do a fixed or a fluid. Columns can be either fixed as a certain amount of pixels or fluid as a percentage, and you can change those around as necessary. You can even have some columns be fixed and some columns be fluid if that's something that you need to do, although I recommend either picking one or the other for each one of your individual grids. There are frameworks that exist in CSS that will do some of this for you, that'll set some of your grids up for you. Bootstrap is a pretty common one. So you can download the Bootstrap CSS files and they will have created some columns and rows for you, which you can then go in and modify in your own personal style sheets. But it gives you a little bit of a starting point. We're not going to be using those in this class, but they are there for you to look for in the future. First thing you need to know is how to set up a grid layout. It's really important in this case that you draw out what you want before you get started. And we're going to go ahead and show you in the tutorial in code how we did this for Pandalisa Chocolates. But the thing to recognize here is that grids are made up of cells, which are intersections of rows and columns. So you have a row, and then inside of a row, you can have columns. You can have different column widths in different rows of the same grid, which is kind of convenient if you want to do something like that. We're going to be using our CSS classes to define our columns, and what we're using is a nice format of column dash numerator dash denominator, where the numerator and the denominator give you a fraction of what percentage of the grid we want to use. So column 1, 1 would be 100%. Column 1, 2 would be 50%. Column 2, 3 would be 2/3 or 67%, and so on and so forth. So we're going to be creating all of these columns so that we can use those really easily when we're setting up our HTML, and it just makes things nice and clean. Because we're going to be floating our columns, we need to make sure that we don't have that row, that container collapse for our rows. So we're going to be adding some after content. In addition, when we do our columns, because we're going to be doing this column numerator denominator, but we're always going to start it with the word column, we can use a rule that says if it starts with COL dash to be able to set some rules for our columns individual or for all of our columns, and then we'll do them individually. Any content that is inside of the column division is now going to be the cell of the grid. So recognize how those are going to go. And let's go look at the code and see how it played out. In this lesson, we're going to be doing the About page. So first we're going to come down to the PC About text. You're going to see all that they've added here is the header, but they have not added any text. So we are going to immediately rename this and add in our author and our date. Okay, so the first thing that we are going to do with our HTML page, so we're going to play with the HTML for a few minutes. We're going to add some details here to our About page. Below the closing header tag, we're going to be adding a div for a row because we're going to be doing this with rows and columns. Actually, before we do that, let's just look at this page in our browser, and you'll see that this is all it is. It's got an image pad and it's got some of our nav bar, but it doesn't have any of our CSS because we haven't added that yet. So let's go ahead and come down here to our header, and we're going to add a row. So we're going to make it a div, we're going to call it a class, and we're going to give it a class name of row. And inside of our row, we are going to add some entries for some columns. So I'm going to go ahead and do those real quick. Remember, with our columns, we are going to type in col dash, and then the numerator and denominator for how much of the page we want it to fill. So 2/3 or 1/3 of the page. So looking at our code right now, you can see that we have 3 classes that are rows. So we have the top one here, we have this middle one here, that's the big one, and then we have a small one here at the bottom. This one here in the middle has a 2/3 column and a 1/3 column, and then inside of the 2/3 column we have another 2 rows with each one there being 1/2. So we've kind of broken this up into a grid style. Now we're going to go through and do some formatting of those grids. And you can see even here with a refresh that you can't really see anything in the grids. There's no data in there yet. We'll be doing that in just a second. So let's work on our PC Grids CSS, which is this one here. So we're going to rename him, get rid of our text, put in our name. And under the grid row style, we are going to define what a row is. So first off, a row needs to clear both sides. So if we have any floating at all, we need to make sure the row starts clear at the bottom underneath any other things. We also want to go ahead and do that after things so that we won't have any collapsing. So we're going to do a div row and we're going to do our after. We're going to clear both. We're going to have our content be nothing. We're going to have our display be a table. Oops. And that's going to go ahead and make those rows for us. When we want to do our column styles, this is going to use kind of like a regular expression to explain what we want to pick for our grid columns. In this case, because all of our grid columns are inside divs, and they are all a type of class that is going to be something along the lines of equals call with a dash in front of it. So remember this little caret in front of the equals says anything that begins with COL and a dash. So we're going to do everything that starts with a COL and a dash, which is going to include all of our columns. And we're going to want all of them to float to the left. Now, we're going to have to set our actual column widths for each of the columns. And we know which ones we've used, but we're going to go ahead and do a couple of them that hopefully you'll understand. We're going to just write them all out in case we want to enter some later that we haven't already used. So we're going to start with 100%. Okay, so at this point you can see that we have 100%, 50%, 25, and 75. And then of course we have our thirds. So any of our column names are already going to be set to that percentage without us having to worry about changing individual items as we go along. As long as we set our names correctly, we should be fine. So now we're going to go back over to our content. So we're going to go back over to our About page here where we were. And in the first row of the grid, we are going to put a header that is going to say Pandalisa Chocolates. So that's up in this one. We're going to do a header 1. And we're going to do About Pandalisa Chocolates. Yes. And you can see it has added that for us because that's in that first row. Next, we're going to go over to the text from our text file. Again, they're kind enough to give you this text file and give you some information. They even formatted it in HTML for you, so you don't have to be adding those p tags and other tags. So I'm going to copy that. I'm going to come back over here to our 2/3 column before the row. So in between the 2/3 and the row, and I'm going to go ahead and paste that in. Oops. And as you can see, pasted it all in. I can again save and refresh, and you'll see it added in the header, the image, and the text. As we're going through, directly after that, we're going to put in an H2 tag of About Chocolate. Some of this is going to be in here and some of it you're just going to have to work on. So this one we're going to go about chocolate. Inside the row before the column. So this is going to be an H2 tag. And we're going to say about chocolate. And let's make that capitalized because we do like those. Then we're going to have our first half and we're going to have our enjoying chocolates. So you'll see here they put that in an H3 so it'll match nicely. We'll plop that right in there. And when we finish that one, we can do our second half, which is going to be our healthy chocolates here that we're going to go ahead and add underneath it. So you can see we got our enjoying chocolates and our healthy chocolates. After we get through that one, we're going to go ahead and add the next two columns, which is the single origin and the ethical produce. You're going to want to do these separately because if you try to do the whole thing at once, you may not get all of the spacing correct. So we're going to plop that one in there and the next one below it. Finally, in the last column that is the 1.3, in this one, we are going to be adding our content for our frequently asked questions. So again, we have our frequently asked questions here, and they are in an aside. So remember with an aside, it means it kind of pulls it to the side for you. We're going to plop that in there like that. Finally, before we hit refresh again, we're going to go ahead and do our footer. But we're going to do our footer inside of that last row. So inside here, we're going to do a footer. And we're going to do Pandasia chocolates. We're going to do a copyright symbol. Remember with the symbols, you have to do your ampersand. In this case, we're going to do copy, add a space, 2001-7, so we know what year we copyrighted it, and all rights reserved. This is a really big thing that you want to put at the end of all of your footers so that nobody can copy your work without giving you credit. So you can see here, now that I've refreshed, we have our about chocolate, our enjoying chocolates, our FAQs, and then down at the bottom with our little copyright symbol. Now we have to add the style sheets because we haven't added those to the page yet, which is why it still looks kind of boring. All the way back up to the head, we're going to go ahead and link. Remember, we've got a link here to an href, and we're always going to start with our reset. Really important to start with your reset. Next, we're going to link our PC grids, which we're going to talk about in a second. And finally, we are going to link our style sheet 2, so our PC styles 2. That's just going to give us a little bit different than our PC styles 1 that we did for our homepage. Now our PC grids is the one that we've been working on here where we set up what did our grids look like. So when I hit refresh, all of a sudden everything changes. Isn't that great how quickly that happens? So we have this all sorted out. Now remember how we set it up. We did a header at the top for our About Pandasia chocolates, which we knew if we did a header probably inside of a row, this one was going to be formatted pretty. We then had our first or our second row, which is going to be from here all the way down to here. First section of that, we had it sectioned into this Our Company section here. And then these were gridded 1, 2, 3, 4 at 50% each. Finally, we had our aside hanging out over here. Remember, asides are always going to pull over to the side. And then finally at the bottom, we have our footer. So hopefully that gave you a good example of how the grid styles work. You can also add attributes to the individual grid borders. In some cases, you're going to want to border your grids just because it looks nice and being able to add a border. Our border attributes are the same as they were from chapter 2, where we have a width, a color, and a style. We can make them solid or inset or outset. We can use different colors, and we can set the width. You can do this with your grid borders the same way you would with any type of an element border. In addition, I just wanted to post on the comment about the drop cap because there is a section in the book and I want to make sure you know what those are. A drop cap is an enlarged initial letter. So what we do is we can take the first letter of an element and make it a different font or a different size or a different float or a different line height and be able to make that look a little bit different. It's described in this section of the book, but they don't really have a picture. So if that's something you want to play with, go for it. In the case of this project, the owner would like to see the grid lines around the grid and make sure that she knows where everything is. So back over in our grids, we have our grid outline style. And for all of our divs, we're going to want to go ahead and add an outline. Now, you would probably not want to keep this outline after you made your site live because it's going to be a little bit obvious. It's got red marks. And but it is a good thing to do while you're still in development, just because it'll help you to understand what's going on. So when I hit refresh here, you'll see that they've put this red markers around all of the divs that are in a grid, just so that you can see how those work. You can see how these two here, even though this one was shorter, it still fit in there just fine. And you can see all of your grid lines. So it's really important to be able to see those if you want to know where your grids are and maybe where things are going. Finally, there's a little bit of details about the CSS grid styles. So when you are using, instead of a display grid to do your template, you can use grid instead of doing the adding the classes to the elements. So what we did in the example was we used a division and we added classes, and therefore we're able to set it up that way. There is in HTML5 a display type of grid, and you can use that instead to do templating of your rows and columns if you want to keep all of your CSS in your CSS file rather than having the class name tell you a little bit about the formatting. We could set that up over in just the CSS styles with a display type of grid. You can use the grid template, rows and columns, to say I want to make my rows be 100 pixels, then an auto, and then 100 pixels. That'll make the one in the middle kind of change in size as much as necessary on a vertical axis, so for each of your rows. For your columns, again, they've done 25, 50, 25%, and that sets it up as a column like that. You can then set each one of the individual elements to be a specific grid row or grid column. Therefore, when you would write your elements in HTML, you would just give them either an element or an element ID or an element type or a class there. And then you can set those using your CSS rules as to how many columns do you want it to be? Do you want it to span over 2 or 3 columns? Where do you want it to start and end? So on and so forth. So these are just a little things you can do with the CSS grid style. We don't do it in this lesson, but I do recommend you look into it and see how those play out. Otherwise, thanks for watching session 3.2. Please come back for session 3.3.